The hiss of steam was a sigh of finality. For 3 days, the train had been Clara Wynn's world, a rattling, soot-stained cocoon of iron and wood. It had carried her away from Kansas, away from the life that had been neatly laid out for her and then abruptly torn apart. Now, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on steel slowed to a groan, the landscape outside the grimy window ceasing its endless, blurry scroll. They had arrived, Red Hollow, Oregon. The name itself felt like a promise and a warning. Red, for the vibrant life she hoped to find, or for the blood and hardship the West was known for. Hollow, for the emptiness in her heart, or for a sheltered place to finally take root. She clutched the handle of her worn leather valise, the knuckles of her free hand white where she gripped the edge of the hard wooden bench. Inside the valise were her worldly possessions, 2 simple, dark wool dresses, one for work, one for Sunday, a change of underthings, a small bar of lye soap wrapped in cloth, and the tattered, soft-covered Bible that had belonged to her mother. Its pages were filled with pressed flowers and whispered prayers, a history of faith more felt than read. Tucked inside its front cover was the letter, the brittle paper that served as her map and her justification. Clara was 29 years old, a widow for 2 years, in the eyes of her late husband's family, and indeed the whole of her small Kansas community. This made her a problem to be solved. She was a woman unmoored, a stray sheep to be guided back into a pen. The suggestions had started subtly, then became a constant, suffocating hum, a second marriage to a respectable, older farmer, a live-in position caring for a sick aunt, a return to her parents' crowded home, where she would once again be a daughter under a father's rule. Each option was a cage, padded with the kindness of those who believed they knew what was best for her. They saw a fragile vessel, shattered by the loss of her husband, Elias. They did not see the cracks that had been there long before he was taken by the fever. Elias had been a good man, a quiet man whose hands were always stained with the earth he worked. He had not been unkind, but their life together had been a script written by others. She was taught to be a wife, to keep a home, to bear children, to be a silent, sturdy support. Her opinions were to be softened, her desires folded away like clean linens, her very presence a quiet apology for the space she occupied. She had tried, for 7 years, she had tried to shrink herself into the shape they required, but no children came, and the silence in their small farmhouse grew louder than the prairie wind. When he died, she grieved not for a great passion lost, but for the life she had never been allowed to build for herself. The true mourning was for her own buried spirit. The letter from a Mrs. Eleanor Abernathy in Red Hollow had been an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to speak aloud. It was a response to an inquiry she had sent on a whim, a desperate cast into the unknown after seeing a notice in a 3-month-old newspaper seeking a woman of good character and steady hand for companionship and light household duties. The reply was brief and formal, but it contained 2 things she craved: a paid position and a train ticket. It was permission to leave. She wasn't coming to Oregon to find a new husband. The thought was as foreign and unappealing as wearing another woman's shoes. She was coming for a reason she could barely articulate, a feeling that had taken root in the hollow space Elias had left behind, the chance to stand on her own 2 feet and not have to ask permission to do so, to breathe without feeling the weight of expectation on her chest. Red Hollow, the conductor's voice boomed, jolting her from her thoughts. He strode down the aisle, his face impassive. End of the line. Clara stood, her legs stiff from sitting. She smoothed the wrinkles from her gray dress, a futile gesture against the dust and wear of the journey. She was a plain woman. She knew. Her hair, the color of dry straw, was pinned in a severe bun at the nape of her neck. Her face was thin, her eyes a pale, watchful blue. There was nothing about her that commanded a second glance, and for most of her life, she had been grateful for it. Today, however, a small part of her wished for a spark of something, a sign that she was more than just a widow in a worn dress. She was the only one to disembark. She stepped down from the carriage, her worn boots sinking slightly into the damp soil and gravel of the makeshift platform. The train hissed, a great beast catching its breath, before the great chuffing began again, the pistons driving it away, leaving her in a sudden, profound silence. She watched it go, the final link to her old life disappearing around a bend of dark green pines. For a moment, a wave of panic, cold and sharp, washed over her. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She took a deep breath, the air thin and cold, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. It was a clean, sharp smell, so different from the flat, dusty scent of the Kansas plains. She turned to face the town. Red Hollow was not a town so much as a wound carved into the side of a mountain. A single steep street clawed its way up the incline, lined with buildings of raw, unpainted timber. They looked temporary, as if they knew the wilderness that surrounded them might one day decide to swallow them whole. There was a general store with a sagging porch, a saloon from which no sound emerged, a blacksmith's shop, dark and silent, and a handful of small, severe-looking houses. Everything was vertical. The street, the towering pine and fir trees that crowded the edges of the clearing, the very mountains themselves, it all seemed to lean in, casting long, oppressive shadows in the late afternoon light. And it was cold, a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with winter and everything to do with altitude and shadow. It seeped through the thin wool of her coat, raising gooseflesh on her arms. It was a lonely, indifferent cold. Her eyes scanned the empty platform, the deserted street. The letter had said Mrs. Abernathy would arrange for her to be met, but there was no one, not a soul, no welcoming face, no one calling her name. The windows of the houses were dark, empty eyes staring back at her. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sighing of the wind in the high branches of the pines. Doubt, a familiar and unwelcome companion, began to whisper in her ear. "You were a fool to come. This was a mistake. Pride has led you to ruin." It was the voice of her mother-in-law, a voice of cautious, fearful piety. Clara squeezed her eyes shut for a second, pushing the voice away. She had not come this far to be undone by an empty platform. Mrs. Abernathy was likely just delayed. She set her valise down, her hands numb with cold. She would wait. She had become an expert at waiting. She stood straight, her chin held at an angle that was more stubborn than proud. She would not let this place, this stark and silent landscape, defeat her before she had even begun. She focused on the details around her, the dark, rich color of the wet earth, the intricate pattern of lichen on a nearby boulder, the way the clouds snagged on the jagged peaks of the mountains to the west. This was real. This was her new life. She would learn its language. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows bled together, turning the spaces between the trees into pools of ink. The cold intensified. A raven called from a high branch, a harsh, guttural sound that seemed to mock her solitary vigil. The panic began to prickle at her again, a cold sweat on the back of her neck. What if the letter was a misunderstanding? A cruel joke? What if Mrs. Abernathy had changed her mind, or worse, had never truly existed at all? She had no money for a return ticket. She had barely enough for a meal. Should she find a place that was serving one, the full, crushing weight of her gamble settled upon her. She had traded a life of quiet suffocation for one of utter desolation. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sharp, but she refused to let them fall. Crying would do no good. Crying was a luxury for women who had someone to see their tears. Just as she was steeling herself to pick up her bag and walk toward the unwelcoming town to find the Abernathy residence on her own, a movement at the edge of her vision made her freeze. From the deep shadows beneath a cluster of towering pines at the far end of the platform, a figure detached itself from the darkness. The movement was slow, deliberate, unhurried. It was a man. He walked not with a city stride, but with a rolling, patient gait that spoke of long hours in the saddle. He was tall, his frame lean but broad in the shoulders, outlined by the fading light. He wore no fancy suit or town coat. Instead, he had on a simple, durable-looking jacket over dark trousers and scuffed, practical boots. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. His hat was pushed back on his head, a plain, weathered thing, revealing dark, thick hair. His face was angular, tanned by sun and wind, a face that belonged to the landscape around them. He looked to be in his mid-30s, a man settled into his own skin. What she noticed most, however, were his hands. They were covered in thick, dark leather gloves, the kind a man would wear for hard work, for handling rope or splintered wood. They were capable hands. He stopped a respectful 10 feet from her, his presence solid and calm in the unnerving silence. He didn't speak immediately, just looked at her, his gaze direct but not invasive. And then she saw his eyes. In a face weathered and carved by the elements, his eyes were a startling, piercing blue, not the pale, watery blue of a summer sky, but the deep, intense blue of a mountain lake, a color that held shadows and depths and a profound, unnerving stillness. They took in her worn dress, her single valise, her rigid posture, and the faint, desperate hope in her face. His expression was unreadable, a mask of neutrality that gave nothing away. The silence stretched, pulled taut between them. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Was this the person sent to meet her a farmhand? He didn't look like the sort of man a respectable woman like Mrs. Abernathy would employ for such a task. Or was he something else? A threat. In this lonely place, a woman had to be careful. Every man was a potential danger until proven otherwise. She found her voice, though it came out as a thin, reedy thing. "I am looking for Mrs. Eleanor Abernathy." The man's gaze didn't waver. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. His voice, when it came, was low and quiet, a gravelly baritone that seemed to be absorbed by the vast wilderness around them rather than projected into it. "I reckon you are, ma'am," he said, and he said nothing more. He just stood there, a silent silhouette against the dying light, his gloved hands at his sides, his deep blue eyes watching her, waiting. And in that moment, Clara Wynne knew that whatever came next, her life had just irrevocably changed. The script was gone. From now on, she would have to write the words herself. His quiet confirmation hung in the frigid air, offering no comfort, no explanation. It was a simple statement of fact, as plain and unyielding as the granite mountains that loomed over the town. Clara felt a surge of frustration prickle beneath her fear. She had not traveled over 1,000 miles to be met with riddles from a silent stranger. She pulled her thin coat tighter, the gesture a physical manifestation of her need to gather what little strength she had left. "Do you know Mrs. Abernathy, sir?" she asked, her voice firmer now. "Were you sent to meet me?" The man, Luke Mercer, shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking softly. For a long moment, he simply studied her, his blue eyes seeming to take in not just her appearance, but the entire weight of her journey, the fragile hope she carried like a flickering candle in a storm. He looked away from her then, his gaze drifting up the empty, muddy street, as if searching for a kinder way to say what had to be said. "I know of her," he finally answered, his eyes returning to hers. There was no malice in his expression, only a quiet, solemn gravity. Everyone in Red Hollow knew Eleanor Abernathy. He paused, letting the past tense settle between them. "But I wasn't sent to meet you." No one was. The words were a cold stone dropping into the well of her stomach. I don't understand," she stammered, the letter in her Bible suddenly feeling like a lie. "She wrote to me. She sent the fare for my ticket. She offered me a position." "When was the letter sent, ma'am?" he asked, his tone gentle but direct. Clara's mind fumbled with the dates. Over 2 months ago, the journey was long. He gave a slow, somber nod, as if she had just confirmed a sad truth he already knew. That would be about right, he said, his voice low. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Mrs. Abernathy passed on. It's been near a month now. The grip came through the valley. It took her and a few others. The world tilted. The sharp edges of the raw-timbered buildings seemed to blur, the oppressive silence of the town rushing in to fill her ears with a deafening roar. Passed on. The words were so simple, so final. The entire foundation of her new life, the single, fragile hope upon which she had staked everything, had crumbled into dust before she had even taken her first step upon it. Mrs. Abernathy was gone. The letter was an echo. The job was a ghost. She was not just alone. She was a mistake. A piece of mail delivered to a house that no longer existed. A tremor started in her hands, a violent shudder she could not control. She wrapped her arms around herself, but it did no good. The cold was inside her now, a deep, cellular dread that threatened to shatter her composure. All the voices she had fled from in Kansas came rushing back. A chorus of smug "I told you so's." Foolish girl. Reckless. You should have stayed where you belonged. She felt a desperate, humiliating urge to sit down right there in the mud and weep. But she didn't. Some hard, stubborn kernel of pride deep within her refused to break. She had not survived 2 years of pitying glances and suffocating kindness in Kansas to fall apart on a train platform in Oregon in front of a stranger. She bit down hard on her lower lip, the sharp pain a welcome anchor in the spinning chaos of her thoughts. She would not cry. Not here. Through the haze of her shock, she became aware that the man was still watching her. He hadn't moved, hadn't offered empty platitudes or awkward condolences. He had simply given her the silence, allowing her the dignity of absorbing the blow. He was observing her. She realized, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet assessment. He was waiting to see what she would do, whether she would shatter or stand. The realization sent a tiny current of strength through her. He must have seen the shift in her posture, the slight lifting of her chin, because he finally spoke again. "My name is Luke Mercer," he said, as if they were having a formal introduction in a warm parlor. "I'm the foreman for the Northridge Ranch, just north of here." The information was a lifeline, though she wasn't yet sure what kind. A foreman, a man with a place, with responsibilities. It gave him a substance that a nameless drifter would not have had. "Clara Wynne," she replied, her own voice sounding distant and hollow. "Mrs. Wynne," he acknowledged with a nod. "Night's coming on fast. It gets cold in these mountains. Colder than you'd think. You can't stay here on this platform." His words were a plain statement of a new, urgent reality. Her grand plan was gone, but the immediate problems of shelter and survival remained. Her mind raced, desperately searching for options. The Abernathy house was empty. The saloon, with its connected hotel, was unthinkable for a woman alone. Knocking on a stranger's door was a gamble she was not willing to take. She had nowhere to go. The vast, dark wilderness that pressed in on the small town suddenly felt like a living thing, an animal waiting to devour her. "Is there a boarding house?" she asked, knowing the answer before the words left her mouth. The town was too small, too raw. "The only rooms for rent are above the saloon," Luke Mercer said, his face impassive. "It's not a place I'd recommend for a lady." He gestured with his head toward the shadows behind him, where she now noticed the dark shape of a buckboard wagon and 2 sturdy-looking horses standing patiently, their breath pluming in the cold air. "I was in town for supplies. I'm heading back to the ranch now." He paused, and she knew an offer was coming. Her entire body tensed. Every warning her mother had ever given her, every cautionary tale about the dangers that awaited women in the world, screamed in her mind. "I can take you somewhere safe for the night," he said. There's a small cabin near the main house. For the cook. It's empty right now. It's clean and it has a stove. You'd be warm." Clara stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm. His offer was both a potential salvation and a potential trap. He was a stranger, a man of the wilderness, and she was a woman with no one to call for if things went wrong. "I thank you for the offer, Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice stiff with caution. "But I don't know you." A flicker of something understanding, maybe even respect, passed through his deep blue eyes. "No, ma'am, you don't, and you're right to be wary. It's a hard world, and a woman alone has to be twice as careful." He did not try to persuade her, did not press his advantage. He simply acknowledged her fear, validating it. "But the alternative is leaving you here. The wolves in these mountains are real, Mrs. Wynne, and they aren't the only predators that come out after dark. Staying here is not an option." He let his words sink in, the stark truth of them undeniable. He wasn't trying to charm her. He was presenting her with a choice between two dangers, one unknown and the other certain. Then he added, "Fact is, ma'am, I find myself in a bit of a predicament, and you might be the solution." This shifted the dynamic entirely. He wasn't offering charity. He was proposing a transaction. "A predicament?" she asked. Her curiosity piqued despite her fear. "My cook," he said, a hint of weariness in his voice. "He was a drifter who claimed he could cook. Turns out he was better at drinking my whiskey and burning beans than anything else. He rode off last week without a word. I have 12 hungry men up at that ranch, and I've been doing the cooking myself for 5 days. I can handle a branding iron and a lariat, but I'm a danger to man and beast with a skillet." He looked at her directly. "Those men are tired of my cooking, and the ranch ledgers are a mess of chicken scratch that I can't make heads or tails of." He was offering a job, not companionship, not some vague position in a silent house, but real, necessary work. The idea was so unexpected, so practical, that it cut through her panic. "We need a cook," he stated plainly. "Someone to keep the bunkhouse accounts, order supplies, maybe patch a shirt or two for a group of men who don't know one end of a needle from the other. It's honest work. We provide the cabin, your meals, and $20 a month." $20. It was a fortune. It was survival. It was independence, bought and paid for with her own labor. She looked at his face, searching for any sign of deception. She saw none. His expression was open, his eyes steady. He was a man with a problem, and he saw her as a possible solution. He wasn't looking at her as a fragile widow to be pitied or a vulnerable woman to be exploited. He was looking at her as a potential worker. In that moment, that was the greatest respect he could have possibly shown her. Still, the risk was immense. To go with this man, to place her life and safety entirely in his hands, was the biggest gamble she had ever taken. She thought of the stifling parlors of Kansas, of the life of dependence that awaited her if she somehow managed to return. Then she looked at the vast, dark forest surrounding them, at the cold, empty street, at the deep blue eyes of the man waiting patiently for her answer. One path led back to a cage she knew. The other led into a wilderness, a place of unknown dangers but also of unknown possibilities. She had come here to stop apologizing for her existence. She had come here to be brave. She drew herself up to her full height. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice clear and steady, devoid of the tremor that had shaken her just moments before. "I will accept your offer, on one condition." He raised an eyebrow slightly, but waited for her to continue. "I will work for you for 1 week," she stated. It was not a question. It was a term. Just 1 week. That will give me time to get on my feet, to learn about this place and find a more permanent arrangement. She was drawing a line, asserting control over her own fate. She was not his to command. She was an employee, entering into a temporary contract. She would not be beholden to him for her rescue. Luke Mercer held her gaze for a long moment. A slow smile touched the corners of his mouth, a subtle expression that did not mock her, but rather seemed to approve of her terms. He saw the steel she was showing, and he respected it. He nodded. "A week is a start," he said. The words were an agreement, a pact made between two strangers on a desolate platform at the edge of the world. The tension that had held her rigid for what felt like an eternity finally began to recede. "All right then, Mrs. Wynne," he said, his tone shifting from negotiation to action. He stepped forward and took her valise. The bag, which had felt so heavy in her hand, seemed to weigh nothing in his. "My wagon's this way. The horses are getting restless." He turned and led the way, his long strides confident in the failing light. Clara hesitated for only a second before following him. She walked behind him to the buckboard, a sturdy, practical vehicle caked with the dust of the trail. He tossed her valise into the back with the sacks of flour and coffee, and then turned to help her up. He put his large, gloved hands on her waist, and for a terrifying, electrifying moment, she felt their strength as he lifted her easily onto the high seat. The touch was impersonal, functional, yet it sent a jolt through her. He walked around to the other side and climbed up beside her, taking the reins in his hands. He didn't say a word, just gave a low whistle, and with a jingle of harnesses and a creak of wood, the wagon lurched forward. They rolled down the steep, empty street, past the silent, watching houses of Red Hollow. As they left the last building behind and the road dissolved into a dark track leading into the immense, pine-scented blackness of the forest, Clara gripped the edge of the seat. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her belly, but alongside it, for the first time since the train had left her behind, was a tiny, fragile spark of something else. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was simply the feeling of moving forward into a life that was utterly, terrifyingly, her own. The journey from Red Hollow to the Northridge Ranch was a descent into a deeper, wilder darkness. The wagon creaked and swayed on the rough track, a tiny, man-made vessel adrift on a black sea of pines. Clara held onto the hard edge of the seat, her body absorbing every jolt and rut. Luke Mercer drove the team with a quiet, focused competence, his profile a stark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. He did not speak, and Clara was grateful for the silence. There were no words for the maelstrom of fear and fragile resolve churning within her. They arrived close to midnight. The ranch was a collection of dark, solid shapes huddled in a wide valley, smelling of pine, horse, and cold earth. A dog barked, a lonely, echoing sound. Luke led her not to the main house, which was a larger, two-story structure dark with sleep, but to a small, separate cabin standing a respectful distance from a long, low bunkhouse. "The cook's cabin," he said, his voice a low rumble. He opened the door, and the scent of stale wood smoke and disuse met them. He struck a match, the sudden flare of light revealing a simple, Spartan room, a narrow cot with a folded blanket, a small iron stove, a rough-hewn table, and a single chair. It was little more than a box to hold a human being, but it had 4 solid walls and a door that locked. It was a sanctuary. "It's not much, but it's warm when the stove is lit. I'll bring some firewood." He left her there, and in the echoing silence, Clara lowered her valise to the floor. This was it. This was the place she had bought with her pride and a 1-week promise. When Luke returned with an armload of wood and kindling, he worked with a swift, silent efficiency, and soon a small fire was crackling in the stove, pushing back the oppressive chill. "The men are up before dawn," he said, turning to leave. "Coffee first, then breakfast. There are supplies in the mess hall next to the bunkhouse. The rest is up to you." He paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "The lock is sturdy. Mrs. Wynne." It was his only acknowledgement of her vulnerability, a simple statement of fact that she appreciated more than any flowery reassurance. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading into the immense quiet of the night. Clara did not sleep. She lay on the narrow cot, fully dressed, listening to the alien sounds of the ranch, the distant stamp and nicker of a horse, the cry of some night creature in the hills, the sigh of the wind as it moved through the valley. Each sound was a reminder of how far she was from everything she had ever known. She rose before the first hint of gray light touched the sky, her body stiff and cold, pinning her hair with numb fingers. She stepped out into the sharp, clean air and made her way to the mess hall. Luke had called it a mess hall. Clara, upon opening the door, felt the term was an understatement. It was a disaster. She had walked into the heart of a world utterly devoid of a woman's touch. The long wooden tables were sticky with the residue of countless meals. A stack of cast-iron pans sat by the huge hearth, each one bearing the black, carbonized remains of some culinary tragedy. The air was thick with the smell of old grease, stale coffee, and unwashed men. It was, she thought with a grim sense of purpose, a battlefield. And she, Clara Wynne, a widow from Kansas who knew how to starch a collar and keep a clean floor, had just arrived at the front lines armed with a bar of lye soap and a will of iron. She did not flinch. She found a bucket, hauled water from the pump outside until her arms ached, and set it to heat over the fire. For 2 hours, she worked in a silent, methodical fury. She scrubbed tables, scoured pots until the iron beneath the char began to show, and swept the floor of mud and debris. She found a sack of coffee beans, and soon the rich, life-affirming aroma began to chase the stale odors from the room. She found flour, thankfully free of weevil's lard, and salt, and her hands, acting from years of ingrained habit, began to move, measuring, mixing, kneading. The cowboys entered just as the sun was clearing the eastern ridge. They came not as a rowdy group, but one by one, silent as ghosts. They were a dozen men, a tapestry of weathered faces, squinting eyes, and beards in various states of untamed growth. They were young and old, lean and wiry, all of them stamped with the same brand of hard labor and quiet endurance. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their bodies tired from a life of constant work. They took their tin plates and cups, their eyes full of a cautious, profound curiosity. They didn't look at her directly, not at first. Instead, they took in the room, the clean tables, the swept floor, the impossibly clean pots hanging by the hearth, and the smell. The air was filled not with the scent of burnt beans, but of fresh coffee and hot, fluffy biscuits. Clara said nothing, simply stood by the stove, her apron on, a queen in her newly conquered territory. She served them bacon and biscuits and poured them black, steaming coffee. They ate. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the scrape of forks on tin plates and the sound of men eating with the focused intensity of the truly hungry. No one spoke a word to her. No one offered a compliment. But they ate every last crumb. They drained the coffee pot. And when they left, one of the older men, a grizzled man with a beard like tangled salt grass named Silas, set his plate down more gently than he had likely set anything down in years. It was the only acknowledgement she received, but it was enough. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the appetites of 12 hard-working men. The work was relentless, more physically demanding than anything she had ever known. It was a cycle of hauling water, chopping vegetables, kneading dough, washing, scrubbing, and starting all over again. In the afternoons, in the brief lull between the midday meal and supper preparations, she tackled the ledgers. Luke had not been exaggerating. They were a chaotic jumble of figures and notes, a history of ranch business written in a language of pure confusion. Clara, with her neat, precise handwriting and her methodical mind, drew lines, created columns, and began to slowly, painstakingly translate the chaos into order. The men remained a silent, watchful presence. They were like a herd of wild horses, easily spooked, their trust not easily won. They spoke to each other in low murmurs, their conversations practical and sparse, about stray cattle, weather patterns, and the condition of a horse's hoof. To her, they said almost nothing, but she felt their eyes on her constantly. They watched the way she moved, efficient and graceful despite her height. They watched her hands, surprisingly strong and capable as she worked, and they listened. They were not used to a woman who spoke only when necessary, who did not fill the silence with nervous chatter. The first crack in their wall of silence came on the third day. A young cowboy, barely a man, with a freckled face and shy eyes named Billy, approached her after supper. He held a wadded-up ball of cloth in his hands, and he looked at the floor as he spoke, his voice a low mumble. "Ma'am," he began, "begging your pardon, but I tore my shirt on a fence. I was wondering if I can pay." Clara looked at the shirt he held out. The sleeve was ripped nearly clean off. Without a word, she took it from him. "Leave it on the porch of my cabin," she said simply. "I will see to it." The next morning, the shirt was lying on his bunk, the sleeve reattached with a seam of such small, perfect stitches it was stronger than the original cloth. Billy said nothing to her, but that evening, a small, intricately carved wooden bird appeared on her porch. After that, the mending became a regular ritual. Each morning, a small, sad pile of torn shirts, ripped trousers, and socks with gaping holes would appear on her porch. It was their way of speaking to her, a silent admission of need. And each evening, the repaired items would be returned, the holes closed, the seams strengthened. It was her silent reply. The second breakthrough was about Beans, the old cowboy. Silas, who had been the ranch's reluctant cook before her arrival, cornered her by the water pump. "Them beans you make," he grumbled, not looking at her. "They ain't mush. Mine are always mush." It was half complaint, half question. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "You're probably putting the salt in too early," she said, her tone matter-of-fact, not condescending. "It makes the skins tough, so they don't hold together. Add it at the very end, just before you serve." Silas grunted, a sound of skeptical acknowledgement, and walked away. But she knew he had listened. She was sharing the secrets of her world, and in doing so, was becoming a part of theirs. Slowly, she was earning her place. Her currency was competence. It was hot coffee at dawn, bread that wasn't hard as a rock, and numbers in a ledger that finally added up. They had begun to see her not as a widow or a woman, but as the cook, a vital, functioning part of the ranch ecosystem. And yet, the questions remained in their eyes, in the quiet moments, when they sat on the bunkhouse porch after a meal. Their gazes would drift to her as she worked in the kitchen or walked to her cabin. They were still trying to figure her out. She was an anomaly, a creature they had no name for. She was not a rancher's wife, soft and protected in the main house. She was not one of the painted women from the saloon in town. She was a woman alone, earning her own way, and she did not seem to be looking for a husband to solve her problems. This was the most confusing part of all. They watched her intelligence, the way she could calculate supply needs in her head. They watched her height, the way she carried herself without the apologetic slump of many women. And they watched her past, her status as a widow, a blank space in her history that they couldn't help but want to fill, in the raw, simple world of the West, where a person's value was measured in strength and utility. Clara's quiet self-possession was a puzzle they had not yet solved. She was useful, yes, but she was not yet understood. And until she was, she would remain an outsider, observed from a safe and silent distance. The 1-week agreement came and went without a word. The 7th day passed just like the 6th, with a dawn of coffee and biscuits and a dusk of savory stew and weary silence. Clara had expected Luke Mercer to approach her, to ask her intentions, to make her state her case for staying. The confrontation she had braced herself for never arrived. She simply woke up on the 8th day, and then the 9th, and kept working. The silence on the matter was its own kind of contract, an unspoken acceptance that was more binding than any written document. She was needed. It was as simple and as profound as that. Her world, once confined to the four walls of a Kansas farmhouse, had expanded to the vast, open-air cathedral of the North Ridge Valley. The land was no longer just a backdrop. It was becoming a text she was slowly learning to read. Luke Mercer was her unlikely teacher, though he never would have used that word. He did not lecture or instruct in the manner of a schoolmaster. His lessons were delivered in quiet asides, in gestures, in observations dropped as casually as a stone into a still pond, leaving ripples of knowledge for her to decipher. One afternoon, as she was shaking a tablecloth outside the mess hall, he rode up and paused, looking not at her but at the sky to the west. A bank of high, wispy clouds, delicate as spun silk, was slowly being overtaken by a lower, darker bruise of vapor. "The wind's shifting," he said, more to his horse than to her. "Smells of rain. The cattle feel it. They'll be heading for the low ground." He said nothing more, just nudged his horse and rode on toward the herd. But Clara looked up, truly looked. For the first time, she saw what he meant, the wispy clouds. Mares' tails. She'd heard them called were a sign of change. She smelled the air, and, for the first time, she could detect the subtle shift in it, a damp, earthy scent that hadn't been there an hour before. In Kansas, her husband, Elias, would have simply said, "A storm's coming? Clara, bring the washing in." It was a command, a statement of fact she was not expected to understand, only to obey. Luke had given her the pieces of the puzzle, the clouds, the scent, the behavior of the animals, and allowed her to put them together herself. He had given her not an order, but a piece of the language of the land. Another day, walking the path from her cabin to the main house to deliver the cleaned-up ledgers. She saw him crouched by the side of the trail. He wasn't looking at her, but at the mud. As she drew near, he pointed with a gloved finger, careful not to disturb the impression. "Deer," he said, his voice low. He indicated two sharp, crescent-shaped marks. "They passed this way this morning. See how the edges are clean?" He then shifted his finger to a set of tracks nearby, rounder, messier. And here, coyote. He drew her attention to the tiny pinpricks at the top of the print. "You can see the claw marks. A cat's print won't show claws. A dog's will." He stood up and looked at her, his blue eyes searching her face to see if she understood. She did. It was more than just a lesson in animal tracks. He was teaching her to see the invisible stories written all over the valley. He was showing her that the world was full of signs for those who knew how to look. That survival here was not about imposing your will on the land, but about listening to what it had to tell you. It was a kind of respect she had never witnessed before. The men in her past life had sought to tame the land, to fence it and plow it into submission. Luke Mercer seemed to be in a quiet, constant conversation with it. These moments began to heal something in her she hadn't known was so broken. In Kansas, her world had been governed by rules made by others, the rules of society, the rules of the church, the rules of her husband's house. Don't speak too loudly. Don't have an opinion that contradicts a man's. Don't want for more than you are given. Here, the only rules that mattered were the rules of the natural world, the sun, the rain, the seasons, the needs of the animals. These were the forces that dictated the rhythm of life, and these were rules she could learn, understand, and live by. They were honest. They asked nothing of her but her attention. They did not demand that she shrink herself. They only demanded that she see. One evening, after the last of the men had drifted from the mess hall to the quiet murmur of the bunkhouse, Clara found she could not bear the confines of her small cabin. The day had been long, the heat of the cook stove oppressive. She took a stool and sat outside, near the low-burning fire pit the men sometimes used. The air was cool and clear, the sky a deep, velvet black strewn with a breathtaking riot of stars. The Milky Way was a luminous river flowing across the heavens, more brilliant than she had ever seen it. In the silence, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet contentment that was still new and fragile. She didn't hear him approach. One moment, she was alone. The next, Luke was standing near the edge of the fire's glow, holding 2 tin cups. He moved with a stillness that was part of the wilderness itself. "Thought you might be cold," he said, handing her one of the cups. It was filled with hot, dark coffee, strong and unsweetened. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer," she said, her fingers wrapping around the welcome warmth of the tin. "Luke," he said quietly. "My name is Luke." It was a small offering, but it felt significant. It moved them from the formal footing of employer and employee to something else, something she couldn't yet name. "Clara," she replied, her voice soft. He nodded and took a seat on a log across the fire from her. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, sipping their coffee, watching the orange and red embers of the fire pulse and glow like a living heart. "You've settled in," he observed. It wasn't a question. "The work is honest," she said, "and the men are quiet." A small, wry smile touched his lips. "They're not used to things being clean, or food tasting good. You've confused them." He took a sip of his coffee, his gaze fixed on the fire. "It's different from Kansas, I'd wager." "The land is bigger here," she said, thinking of the flat, endless plains she had left behind. "And the silence is different." "How so?" She considered this. In Kansas, the silence was empty. It was about what wasn't there. Here, she looked up at the immense, star-filled sky, at the dark, powerful shapes of the mountains surrounding them. Here, the silence is full. It's alive. He looked at her then. A real look. One that went past her role as the cook and saw the woman sitting before him. There was a flicker of surprise, of appreciation, in his deep blue eyes. "You see it," he said softly. "Most people who come from out east, they just see dirt and trees. They don't see the life in it." The compliment, so simple and sincere, warmed her more than the coffee. It was a validation of the changes happening within her. He looked away again, back to the fire, as if gathering his thoughts. "Did you spend much time with horses back home?" "Clara," he asked, his tone casual. The question caught her off guard. Horses, in her old life, had been a symbol of the things she could be near but never control. "I have," she answered, her voice quieter than she intended. "My father had a gentle mare, and Elias, my husband, he kept 2 draft horses for the plow." "Did you ride?" The memory was sharp and clear. A familiar, dull ache. She saw herself as a girl, perched on the broad back of the mare, her father walking beside her, his large hand holding the lead rope in a firm, unyielding grip. She saw herself as a wife, sitting side saddle in her Sunday dress, Elias holding the reins, guiding the horse at a slow, respectable pace. She was always a passenger, always a precious, fragile thing to be led and protected. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked at Luke, at his strong, capable hands wrapped around his coffee cup, hands that knew how to guide a 1,000-pound animal with a subtle shift of pressure. "But I was never allowed to hold the reins." The words hung in the space between them, freighted with a meaning that went far beyond horses. It was the confession of a lifetime, the summary of her entire existence. She had been led, guided, protected, and controlled. The simple leather straps that connected a rider to a horse had been a symbol of a power she was never meant to wield. Luke did not respond immediately. He didn't offer words of pity or surprise. He simply absorbed her statement, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. He looked down into his cup, then back into the flames. A long, profound silence stretching between them. She felt a sudden flush of shame, as if she had revealed too much, exposed a weakness she should have kept hidden. But when he finally looked up, there was no pity in his eyes. There was only a quiet, resolute understanding. He had heard not just her words, but the lifetime of meaning behind them. Without a word, he stood up. He drained his coffee cup and set it on the log. "Come with me," he said. It was not a request. It was a soft-spoken command that held an invitation. Puzzled, she stood and followed him. He led her away from the fire, toward the main corral, a large enclosure of sturdy wooden fences where the ranch's saddle horses were kept. The moonlight washed the world in shades of silver and black, and the horses were dark, sleeping shapes. One of them, a calm-looking bay mare, lifted her head as they approached. Her ears pricked forward. Luke entered the corral, moving with a quiet confidence that the animal understood. He spoke to the mare in a low, soothing murmur, stroking her neck before slipping a bridle over her head. He led her out and tied her loosely to the fence. He worked with an unhurried, practical grace, fetching a saddle and blanket from the tack room. He didn't ask Clara for help, but he didn't exclude her either. He simply did the work, his movements efficient and sure in the pale light. He cinched the saddle, checked the straps, and then turned to her. He didn't offer to lift her into the saddle. He simply brought the mare alongside a low fence rail, a silent suggestion for a mounting block, and held the stirrup steady. Clara understood. He was not going to treat her like a fragile doll. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she put her boot in the stirrup and swung herself up into the saddle. It felt strange and unfamiliar to sit astride a horse, her legs on either side. Instead of perched precariously side saddle, it felt balanced, solid, powerful. Luke stood by the mare's head, his hand resting gently on her neck. He gathered the thick, smooth leather reins. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She expected him to pass her a lead rope, to take his place at the horse's head to guide her around the corral like a child. Instead, he stepped up close to her, his shoulder brushing against her knee. He looked up at her, his face serious in the moonlight. He held out the reins, the leather pooled in his gloved hands. "This time," he said, his voice low but clear, cutting through the vast silence of the night. "You hold them." He pressed the reins into her hands. The leather was cool and smooth and substantial. It was a tangible weight, a physical connection to the living, breathing power beneath her. She closed her fingers around them, her knuckles white. For the first time in her life, she was in control. The path, for once, was hers to choose, and as she looked out over the moonlit valley, the reins held firmly in her grasp. She felt the first true, terrifying thrill of freedom. The sky had been talking for 2 days, using the language Luke had begun to teach her. It started with the high, feathery mare's tails, followed by a sky that turned the color of a dull pewter bowl. The wind lost its playful edge and began to keen, a low, mournful sound that worked its way through the chinks in the cabin walls. The cattle were restless, bunching together in the low pastures, their heads turned away from the coming onslaught. For the first time, Clara felt the change not as an observer, but as a participant. She felt the drop in pressure in her own bones. The storm did not arrive. It attacked. It struck the valley just after noon, a sudden, violent fist of wind and rain that seemed to come from all directions at once. The rain was an icy, horizontal torrent, battering the windows and turning the hard-packed earth of the ranch yard into a churning sea of mud. Within an hour, the rain had turned to sleet, tiny, sharp pellets of ice that rattled against the roof like a frantic drum roll. And then, as the world outside was swallowed by a premature twilight, the sleet softened into snow. It was not a gentle, picturesque snowfall. It was a thick, blinding curtain of white, a suffocating blanket that erased the world, shrinking the vast valley down to the small, flickering circle of light cast by the lamps in the mess hall. The men had been driven in from the range, their face raw and red, their mood as grim as the sky. They huddled around the stove, the smell of wet wool and damp leather filling the air. Clara kept the coffee pot perpetually full, its bitter, bracing steam a small defiance against the storm's raw power. There was little talk, They all knew what a storm like this, arriving so early in the season, could mean. The door to the mess hall burst open, slamming against the inside wall with a crash that made every man jump. A figure stood framed in the doorway, a ghost of snow and ice. It was young Billy, his face a mask of frozen desperation. He had been sent that morning with 2 other hands, Jed and Charlie, to move a small herd of 50 yearlings from a high summer pasture down to the safety of the valley. "They're gone," Billy choked out, his voice cracking, his chest heaving as he fought for breath. "We were in the upper canyon when it hit. The snow, it was like a wall. We couldn't see. The herd scattered. Jed's horse went down. His legs busted. Charlie's with him, trying to keep him warm. I came for help. They're gone. Luke, the whole herd." A stunned silence fell over the room. 50 yearlings. It was a devastating loss, a significant blow to the ranch's finances, but it was more than that. It was a failure, a defeat at the hands of the wilderness. Luke Mercer was on his feet before Billy had finished speaking. The lazy calm he usually projected was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity that electrified the room. His face was hard, his blue eyes narrowed and fierce. He was no longer a quiet observer of the land. He was a commander facing a battle. "Silas, get a wagon ready. We'll need blankets, whiskey, splints for Jed. Billy, get in here by the fire before you freeze solid. Tell me exactly where you left them." He began barking orders, his voice cutting through the paralysis that had gripped the other men. He pointed to 2 of the most experienced hands. "Hank, Dave, saddle the 2 strongest horses. We're going after the herd." Clara watched from the hearth, her hands clenched in her apron. She saw the grim set of their jaws, the practiced way they moved to obey, the quiet understanding of the danger they were about to face. Her role in this drama was clear. She was the woman, the cook. Her job was to keep the fire lit, to have hot stew ready for their return. She was the anchor, the safe harbor. It was the role she had played her entire life. But as she watched Luke pull on a heavy sheepskin coat, his movements economical and precise, something inside her rebelled. It was the memory of the leather reins in her hands, the feeling of the powerful animal beneath her, moving to her command. She had tasted control, and she could not go back to being a passive spectator. She walked toward him, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The men stopped their preparations, their eyes turning to her, their faces a mixture of surprise and confusion. "I'm coming with you," she said. The words dropped into the tense silence of the room. Luke stopped, his hand halfway into the sleeve of his coat, and turned to face her. He looked at her as if she had suddenly started speaking in a foreign tongue. "No," he said, his voice flat and final. "You are not. You'll need help," she insisted, her voice quiet but firm, refusing to be dismissed. "You'll be focused on the cattle. Who will manage the lanterns? Who will make sure the supplies don't get lost in the snow? I can ride. I won't slow you down." "Clara, this is not a gentle ride in a moonlit corral," he said, his voice sharp with impatience and a raw, protective edge. "This is a blizzard on a mountain. Men die in storms like this. It is no place for you." "The place for me is where I can be of use," she retorted, her chin lifting. "I am not a china doll to be kept on a shelf. I am stronger than you think. Let me help." He stared at her, a battle raging in his eyes. Every instinct he had, every rule the world had taught him about protecting women, screamed at him to refuse, to order her to stay. But he also saw the unyielding steel in her gaze, the quiet, stubborn strength she had shown every day since her arrival. He saw not a fragile widow, but a capable woman demanding her right to be a partner in the fight, not a ward to be protected from it. He saw the same spirit that had made her demand a 1-week contract, the same fire that had made her hold the reins. "Damn it!" he bit out, the words a surrender. He turned to the others. "Give her a horse, and a coat that will fit." He didn't look at her again, but the argument was won. A thrill sharp and terrifying, shot through her. The world outside the ranch yard was a maelstrom of white fury. The wind howled, a physical force that tore at their clothes and stole the breath from their lungs. The snow was so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. It was like riding into a churning bucket of milk. Luke led the way, his broad back a dark, reassuring shape against the chaos. Clara rode behind him, with Hank and Dave flanking her, their silent presence both a comfort and a reminder of her audacity. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. The cold was a living thing, a predator with icy claws that sank deep into her bones. Her borrowed coat, though thick, was no match for the biting wind. Her face was numb, her eyelashes heavy with ice. But she gritted her teeth and held on. Her focus narrowed to the simple, brutal task of staying in the saddle and keeping Luke's silhouette in sight. Disaster struck an hour into their search. They were navigating a steep, treacherous slope, the horses struggling for purchase on the snow-covered rocks. Clara's horse, a normally sure-footed mare, suddenly lost its footing. The world tilted violently. She heard the horse scream, a terrifying sound of pain and fear. As it went down, she was thrown clear, landing in a deep drift of snow that cushioned her fall. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding, her first thought for the animal. But as she put weight on her left leg, a bolt of white-hot agony shot from her ankle up to her knee. She cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound that was swallowed by the wind, and collapsed back into the snow. The men were on her in an instant. Luke was kneeling beside her, his face a grim mask of concern. "Clara, are you all right?" "My leg," she gasped, the pain making her vision swim. I think it's broken." Hank carefully cleared the snow from her leg. Her boot had been twisted at a sickening angle. He gently probed her ankle, his touch surprisingly gentle for such a rough man. "It's not broken," he announced, his voice a low rumble. "But it's a bad sprain. You won't be able to ride." "We have to get her back to the ranch," Dave said, his voice full of worry. "No," Clara said, her voice sharp with desperation. She pushed herself up, her face pale but determined. "No, you can't turn back because of me. The cattle." "The cattle aren't worth your life," Luke said, his voice harsh. He was already planning their retreat. "We'll rig a litter." "You will not," she commanded, the force of her will shocking them all into silence. She looked at Luke, her eyes blazing. "I will not be the reason you fail. I told you I wouldn't be a burden, and I meant it. Tear a strip from my petticoat. Bind my ankle as tight as you can. Help me back on my horse. I can still hold a lantern." He stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and a grudging, profound respect. This was not the plea of a frightened woman. It was the command of a soldier refusing to leave the field. He saw her grit, her absolute refusal to be seen as weak, and he knew he could not argue. Without another word, he pulled a knife from his belt, and with a grim efficiency, they did as she asked, binding her ankle until it was a tight, throbbing knot of pain. Getting her back on the horse was an agonizing ordeal, but she bit her lip until it bled and did not make a sound. They found the yearlings huddled in a narrow box canyon, their backs to the wind, their coats caked with snow. They were miserable but alive. The men worked with a desperate urgency, their shouts and whistles barely audible above the storm, pushing the terrified animals out of the canyon and into a semblance of a herd. Clara's role, as she had promised, was to be the beacon. She held the main lantern aloft, the pain in her leg a roaring fire, but her hand was steady. The small, yellow flame was the single point of reference in the swirling chaos, a lighthouse in the blizzard that the men used to orient themselves. The storm, however, was not done with them. The wind rose to a demonic shriek, and the snow became so dense that it was impossible to move the herd. They were losing ground, the cattle threatening to scatter again. "We can't make it back," Luke yelled over the wind. We need shelter. The rock formations to the north. He led them toward a dark slash in the landscape, a series of granite outcrops that offered a sliver of protection from the storm's full fury. They found a shallow cave, little more than a deep overhang of rock, but it was enough. They drove the cattle into the back of the sheltered space and huddled together near the entrance. A small, exhausted knot of humanity and beast, while the blizzard raged outside. The cold in the cave was absolute. They were all soaked to the skin, their bodies shaking with uncontrollable shivers. The single lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the rock walls, illuminating their grim, ice-crusted faces. Clara slid from her horse into Luke's arms, her injured leg unable to support her. He lowered her gently to the ground, propping her against the rock wall. The pain was a nauseating, relentless wave. She had done it. She had come, but now, in the cold, miserable darkness, the doubt she had held at bay for so long came crashing in. She looked at the weary faces of the men. She looked at Luke, who was checking the herd. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Had her stubborn pride made things worse? Had her presence been a distraction, a danger they shouldn't have had to manage? He came and crouched beside her, his face close to hers, his expression unreadable in the dim light. They were so close she could see the ice clinging to his eyebrows, feel the cold radiating from his soaked coat. "What if I was wrong?" she whispered, her voice a raw, trembling thing, the words torn from the deepest, most terrified part of her soul. "What if I put you in danger? What if my being here was a mistake?" He looked at her, his blue eyes holding hers. He was as cold, as wet, as exhausted as she was. There was no room for lies or platitudes in this frozen, desperate place. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes, the crushing weight of a lifetime of being told she was wrong, that her impulses were a liability. "Then we learn," he said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the howl of the wind, through the chatter of her teeth, through all her fear. He reached out and, with his gloved thumb, gently wiped a frozen tear from her cheek she hadn't even realized had fallen. "We learn how to do it again, but better. Wrong isn't the end, Clara. It's just the start of the next lesson." And in the heart of the storm, huddled in the freezing dark, his words were a greater warmth than any fire. It was permission. Permission to try, to dare, and even to fail. It was the answer to a question she hadn't known she'd been asking her entire life. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside the small, sheltered space, something had fundamentally, irrevocably settled. They returned from the mountain not as a conquering party, but as a band of weary survivors, bound by the shared trial of the storm. The descent was a slow, agonizing ordeal. Clara, her leg a throbbing monument to her stubbornness, rode with her jaw set, refusing to show the pain that radiated with every jarring step of the horse. Luke stayed close, his presence a silent, steady shield against the lingering fury of the wind. When they finally rode into the ranch yard with the full count of yearlings, a ragged, collective sigh of relief went through the men who had been left behind. They had not been defeated. Clara became, for a time, an invalid queen ruling from her cabin. Luke, with a surprising gentleness, had examined and rebandaged her ankle, declaring it a bad sprain that needed nothing more than rest. The cowboys, who had once viewed her with a distant, cautious respect, now treated her with a new, almost reverent deference. Young Billy appointed himself her water carrier and wood hauler. Old Silas, in a shocking display of culinary initiative, took over the coffee pot in the mornings, brewing a concoction so thick and black it could have dissolved a horseshoe, but he did it with a fierce, protective pride. They had seen her in the storm. They had seen her fall, and they had seen her get back up. In their simple, unwritten code of the West, she had proven her mettle. She was no longer just the cook. She was one of them. Her convalescence was a strange and quiet time, confined to her cabin. She watched the life of the ranch unfold through her small window. She saw the endless cycle of work, the mending of fences, the training of horses, the quiet camaraderie of the men. She was a part of it, yet separate. The experience in the storm had forged a bond, but it had also highlighted a fundamental difference. She was still the only woman in a world of men. After 2 weeks, the swelling in her ankle had subsided enough for her to walk with a pronounced limp. Leaning on a sturdy branch Luke had fashioned into a crutch, she resumed her duties, moving with a slow, deliberate pace that infuriated her independent spirit but was nonetheless necessary. The ranch was nearly out of several key supplies: flour, salt, and beans. A trip to Red Hollow was unavoidable. Luke offered to go alone. "You're not ready for a long ride on the wagon," he said, his brow furrowed with concern. "I am perfectly capable of sitting on a wagon seat," she countered, her tone sharper than she intended. The thought of being left behind, of being protected and cosseted, chafed at her. "Besides, I know what brands of baking soda work best, and you need to sign for the new wire shipment at the general store. It makes the most sense for me to go." He saw the familiar, unyielding set of her jaw and knew it was pointless to argue. He simply nodded. "We'll leave after the morning chores." The journey to town was different this time. The world was not a terrifying, unknown darkness, but a landscape she was beginning to know. She recognized the stand of aspens where a deer herd often grazed, the high ridge where she had seen an eagle circling. The silence between her and Luke was no longer the tense quiet of strangers, but the comfortable silence of two people who had faced a common enemy and survived. Red Hollow, however, had not changed. It was still a raw, judgmental gash in the side of the mountain. As Luke pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the general store, Clara felt a familiar prickle of apprehension. The town, in its smallness, was a magnifying glass for rumor and speculation. Her existence at the Northridge Ranch had not gone unnoticed. It was a juicy piece of gossip, a scandalous mystery in a place starved for entertainment. A widow, living alone amongst a dozen cowboys, tended to by the quiet, solitary foreman, a man who had shown no interest in any of the town's eligible daughters. The story wrote itself, and it was not a kind one. She felt it the moment she stepped down from the wagon. It was in the way Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, paused in her sweeping of the porch, her eyes narrowing into slits of appraisal. It was in the way two women, clustered by the post office, abruptly stopped their conversation as she passed, their whispers following her like a cloud of biting insects. Clara kept her head high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but she heard the fragments of words carried on the wind. Foreman's woman. No better than she ought to be. Out there, all alone. Inside the store, the air was thick with unspoken judgment. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, was civil enough, but his eyes kept darting from her to Luke and back again, a greasy curiosity in his gaze. While Luke dealt with the wire shipment, Clara gathered her supplies. She moved through the store with a cold, deliberate dignity, acutely aware of the other customers, all women, who watched her from the corners of their eyes. They moved away as she approached the dry goods, creating a small, invisible circle of exclusion around her. The same women who had likely spent their lives hemmed in by rules and expectations were now the most vicious enforcers of those same invisible fences. Her crime was not a sin of the flesh, but a sin of independence. She was living outside their understanding, and for that, she could not be forgiven. Leaving the store, the ordeal intensified. A group of rough-looking men were lounging on the porch of the saloon across the street. Their gazes were not subtle. They were hungry, insolent looks that stripped her bare, assessing her as if she were a piece of livestock up for auction. One of them made a low, suggestive comment to his friends, followed by a burst of coarse laughter. A cold, hard fury rose in Clara's throat. It was an anger so pure and white-hot it almost choked her. She wanted to scream at them, to shame them with the force of her contempt. She wanted to turn to the whispering women and demand to know what they were so afraid of. But she did nothing. She knew that any reaction would be seen as a confession, a confirmation of their ugly assumptions. So she did the only thing she could. She endured. She loaded her sacks of flour into the wagon, her movements stiff, her face an unreadable mask, while Luke's jaw tightened into a line as hard as granite. He finished his business, his own movements clipped and angry, and soon they were pulling away, leaving the suffocating judgment of Red Hollow behind. The silence on the ride back was heavy and painful. The comfortable quiet was gone, replaced by a chasm of unspoken things. Clara stared at the unending wall of pines, her mind replaying every slight, every sneer, every lewd glance, the freedom she had felt, the sense of belonging she had started to build at the ranch, felt like a fragile illusion, easily shattered by the poison of a small town's gossip. She had thought herself strong, but the old wounds, the ones carved into her by a lifetime of being told to be small and silent, had been reopened. She felt a familiar, sickening shame, as if she truly had done something wrong. The pain in her ankle was nothing compared to the ache in her soul. They were almost back at the ranch when they saw a figure walking on the road ahead. It was a woman, walking with the weary, slumped posture of someone carrying a heavy burden. As they drew closer, Clara recognized her as Sarah Miller, a young woman she had seen in town, usually with two small, tow-headed children in tow. Today, she was alone, and she looked to be on the verge of tears. Luke pulled the wagon to a halt beside her. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice gentle. "It's a long walk back to your homestead. Can we offer you a ride?" Sarah Miller looked up, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed. She clutched a small, bundled object in her hands. "Oh, Mr. Mercer, thank you," she stammered, her relief palpable. "My wagon threw a wheel a mile back. My husband is trying to fix it, but my little Jacob, he's taken with a fever, and I was just trying to get home to him." Luke helped her onto the back of the wagon, and Clara shifted to make room for her. As Sarah settled herself, the bundle in her hands fell open. It was a small boy's shirt, made of simple, faded blue cotton. There was a long, ragged tear in the sleeve. "Oh, fiddlesticks," Sarah sighed, a fresh wave of despair washing over her face. "His only other good shirt. I was going to mend it tonight, but now with the wagon and the fever, I just don't know how I'll find the time." She looked at the torn shirt as if it were the single, final straw that would break her. In that moment, something shifted in Clara, looking at Sarah's exhausted face, at the simple, overwhelming problem of the torn shirt. The poisonous whispers of the town faded into insignificance. The women in the general store, the men outside the saloon, they were a Greek chorus of idle cruelty. This was real. This was the hard, unvarnished truth of a woman's life, here a constant, grinding battle against time, sickness, poverty, and entropy. Without a second thought, Clara reached out. "Give it to me," she said. Sarah looked at her, confused. "What?" "The shirt," Clara said, her voice soft but sure. "Give it to me. I have thread and a steady hand. It will be mended by the time we reach your turnoff." Tears welled in Sarah Miller's eyes. They were not tears of despair, but of a profound, shattering gratitude. She looked at Clara, not as the foreman's woman or the subject of town gossip, but as another woman who understood, who saw her struggle and offered not judgment, but a simple, practical act of kindness. "Would you?" she whispered. I couldn't possibly." "It is no trouble at all," Clara said firmly. She took the small shirt, and from a mending kit she always kept in her apron pocket, she produced a needle and thread. As the wagon rumbled on, her hands, steady and sure, began to work, drawing the torn fabric together with small, neat stitches. And as she sewed, she realized the truth. The gossips in town, they saw her as a threat because they were trapped in their own small worlds, and her freedom frightened them. But Sarah Miller, She saw Clara as a resource, an ally. There were two kinds of people looking at her, those who judged, and those who needed. And for the first time, Clara understood that she could choose which group she wanted to answer to. By the time they reached the turnoff to the Miller homestead, the sleeve was perfectly mended, the seam stronger than the surrounding cloth. Sarah took it, her hands trembling. She couldn't offer money. Clara knew, but she offered something more valuable. "Thank you, Mrs. Wynne," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means." She looked Clara directly in the eye, and in her gaze, there was no judgment, only a deep, shared understanding. After they dropped her off, a new, powerful idea began to form in Clara's mind. It was born of the town's cruelty and Sarah Miller's gratitude. It was an idea about creating a space, a sanctuary from both. That evening, she approached Luke as he was rubbing down his horse in the barn. "I need to build something," she said without preamble. He stopped his work and looked at her, his expression patient, waiting. "There's a lean-to on the north side of the barn," she continued, her words coming faster as the idea took shape. "The one where you store the old lumber. It's protected from the wind. The roof is sound. I want to clean it out. Enclose the front wall. Put in a stove and a few chairs." "What for?" he asked. His curiosity piqued. "For the women," she said, her voice filled with a new, unshakable purpose. "Like Mrs. Miller. They have no place to go in town. The store is for business. The church is for Sundays. There is no place for them to simply sit, to talk, to rest for a moment while their husbands are in the saloon or the blacksmith's. A place where a child's shirt can be mended and a cup of coffee can be had without having to pay for it in whispers and ugly looks." She looked at him, her eyes shining with the clarity of her vision. "I want to build a room, a mending and coffee room, a place where women can come and not be judged, a place where they can be helped." Luke looked at her for a long moment, at the determined set of her jaw, at the fierce compassion in her eyes. He saw the brilliant, simple logic of it. He saw not a flight of fancy, but a practical solution to a problem no one else had even bothered to see. He saw the storm in her, and the shelter she was determined to build in its wake. He gave a slow nod. "There's some good, milled lumber from the old line shack piled behind the bunkhouse," he said quietly. "Better than that warped stuff in the lean-to. I'll have Billy and Dave move it for you in the morning." It was all he said, but it was everything she needed to hear. It was his blessing, his support, his partnership. She was not just building a room, she was building a future. She was taking the ugliness of the world and using it as fuel to create something beautiful and strong. Right here, on the edge of the wilderness, she would build her own damn harbor. The mending and coffee room was born of necessity and built with defiant hope, with the help of Billy and Dave, who worked with a quiet, diligent pride. The dilapidated lean-to was transformed. They raised a new front wall, fitted with a proper window and a sturdy door. They installed a small pot-bellied stove that Silas procured from a scrapped wagon, and the Cowboys built simple, sturdy furniture from the leftover lumber, a long table, a few benches, and shelves for supplies. It did not open with a grand announcement. It simply began. Sarah Miller was the first to visit, bringing another torn shirt and a small sack of potatoes from her root cellar as payment. She stayed for an hour, sipping hot coffee while Clara mended the shirt, and for the first time since coming to Oregon, she spoke to another woman without the fear of judgment. She spoke of her husband's struggle to clear their land, of her fears about the coming winter, of the simple, bone-deep weariness of a mother's life. Clara listened. She didn't offer advice or platitudes. She simply listened, her needle moving in a steady, rhythmic dance, and that was enough. Word spread, not through the gossip channels of Red Hollow, but through the quiet, resilient network of the homestead women. They came one by one, timidly at first, then with a growing sense of purpose. They came from isolated cabins tucked into the folds of the mountains. Women who went weeks without seeing another female face. They brought their mending, their worries, their children. They brought small offerings, a jar of preserves, a bundle of dried herbs, a loaf of dense, dark bread. Clara's room became a sanctuary. It was a place of warmth and light in the encroaching cold of winter. The air was always filled with the comforting smells of coffee, wood smoke, and clean linen. Here, women could set down their burdens for an hour or two. They could speak freely, their conversations a tapestry of practical concerns and quiet confessions. They were no longer isolated islands of struggle. They were a community. Clara, the scandalous widow from the Northridge Ranch, had become their unlikely center, the still point around which their scattered lives could briefly, gently revolve. She did not charge for the coffee or the mending. She accepted their barter, creating a small, circular economy of kindness, and in doing so, she earned a kind of loyalty that was fierce and unshakable. The women of the homesteads became her silent, watchful defenders. When they went into Red Hollow for supplies, they no longer averted their eyes when Clara's name was mentioned. They met the whispers with a cool, direct gaze that spoke volumes. They did not argue. They simply did not participate. Their silence was a shield. As the first deep snows of winter blanketed the valley, turning the world to a pristine canvas of white and gray, talk began of the annual winter festival. It was the one time of year the entire scattered community gathered, held in the town's single church, which served as a makeshift hall for the occasion. It was a night of music, food, and dancing, a brief, joyful rebellion against the long, dark months of isolation. The cowboys at the ranch spoke of it with a boyish excitement. It was a chance to wear a clean shirt, to see a new face, to perhaps even dance with a girl who didn't smell of horses and leather. Their anticipation filled the mess hall with a restless energy, and in their glances toward Clara, there was an unspoken question. Would she go? The thought terrified her. To go to the festival would be to walk willingly into the lion's den. It would mean facing the collective, concentrated judgment of Red Hollow. Every woman who had whispered behind her back, every man who had eyed her with insolent speculation. They would all be there, under one roof. It would be an ordeal, a public trial by a jury that had already declared her guilty. It would be so much easier to stay in her cabin, to plead a lingering weakness in her ankle, to remain in the safe, quiet world she had built for herself. One evening, as she was serving supper, young Billy cleared his throat, a sound like a nervous chicken. "Ma'am," he began, his face turning a blotchy red. "We was all wondering. The festival. It's got a proper fiddler this year, from down the valley. They say he can play a waltz that'll make a grizzly bear weep." He trailed off, his courage failing him. "What Billy's trying to say," Silas grumbled, coming to the boy's rescue, "is that a man can't get a proper dance if his partner's two left feet belong to Dave. It'd be a shame for that fiddler to waste his talent." It was their invitation. It was clumsy and indirect, but it was heartfelt. They wanted her there. They were proud of her, and they wanted the world to see her as they saw her, not as a scandalous widow, but as the woman who had faced down a blizzard and could mend a shirt so perfectly you couldn't find the seam. They were offering her their protection, their collective presence as a bulwark against the town's scorn. She looked across the room at Luke. He was leaning against the far wall, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching her. He said nothing, but his eyes held a quiet challenge. "Are you the woman who held the reins they seemed to ask? Are you the woman who refused to turn back in the storm?" Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a slow, hot anger began to burn. Why should she hide? What had she done to be ashamed of? She had worked hard. She had been a good neighbor. She had created something of value from nothing. She would not allow the petty, fearful minds of a few gossips to pen her in. She had not come all this way to live in another cage, even if it was one of her own making. "I suppose," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the suddenly silent room, "that I ought to hear this fiddler for myself." A slow grin spread across Billy's face. Silas grunted in satisfaction. And across the room, Luke Mercer gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod of approval. The night of the festival was bitingly cold, the stars sharp as chips of ice in the black sky. The church was a beacon of golden light and muffled music, its warmth spilling out onto the pristine snow. As Luke helped her down from the wagon, Clara took a deep, steadying breath. This was it. She had spent the afternoon preparing herself, and her preparations had been a series of small, deliberate acts of defiance. She reached for the black dress she kept for funerals and Sundays, the uniform of a respectable widow. Then she stopped. She was not in mourning. She was not a symbol of grief. She pushed the black dress aside and pulled out the one other good dress she owned, one she had made herself long ago and had never had the courage to wear. It was the color of a deep, twilight purple, the color of bruises and royalty. Next, she sat before the small, cracked mirror in her cabin and began to unpin her hair. For her entire adult life, her hair had been scraped back, twisted, and imprisoned in a severe, tight bun. It was the style of a woman who did not wish to be noticed. With trembling fingers, she pulled the pins free, and her hair, thick and the color of autumn wheat, cascaded down her back. She brushed it until it shone in the lamplight. It felt strange and wild, a living thing against her skin. She reached for her corset, the rigid cage of whalebone and laces that had shaped her body into an acceptable, fashionable silhouette for years. It was an instrument of constriction, designed to make a woman smaller, to literally take her breath away. She looked at it, lying on her cot. Then she turned away. Tonight, she would not be made smaller. Tonight, she would breathe. Finally, she pulled on her boots. Not the thin, impractical shoes of a townswoman, but the sturdy, comfortable leather boots she wore every day. They were scuffed and worn, but they were honest. They were the boots of a woman who stood on her own 2 feet, on solid ground. When she stepped out of her cabin, Luke was waiting. He stopped, his hand on the wagon rail, and simply stared. He took in the rich purple of her dress, the startling, unbound freedom of her hair. He saw that she stood taller, straighter, without the rigid confinement of a corset. He saw the woman she was choosing to be, and a slow, profound admiration dawned in his eyes. He said nothing, offered no compliment. He simply held out his hand to help her into the wagon, his touch gentle but firm. The moment they stepped through the church doors, the music, a lively reel played on a fiddle and a guitar, faltered and died. The hum of conversation ceased as if a switch had been thrown. Every head in the crowded, lamplit room turned toward them. A wave of absolute, deafening silence washed over the gathering. Clara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, a physical weight of shock and condemnation. She saw the women of the town, their faces masks of open-mouthed disbelief. They saw her dress, not the somber black of a widow, but a color of defiant life. They saw her hair, loose and free, an act of scandalous impropriety. They saw her silhouette, natural and uncorseted, a flagrant rejection of their rigid standards. They saw a woman who was refusing to play by their rules. She saw the men, their initial surprise shifting to a raw, speculative curiosity. Her presence, her very appearance, was a challenge to them, an unknown quantity they did not know how to categorize. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, every instinct screamed at her to flee, to run back into the safety of the night. Her hands grew cold, and she felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted to shrink, to make herself invisible, to bow her head and apologize for her own audacity. Then she felt Luke's hand, a warm, solid presence on the small of her back. It was not a possessive gesture, but one of silent, unwavering support. "I am here," it said. "You are not alone." She drew a deep breath, a full, unimpeded breath that filled her lungs. She lifted her chin. She did not look at the floor. She looked out at the sea of hostile, astonished faces. She saw Mrs., gable, her mouth a perfect O of outrage. She saw the men from the saloon porch, their leering grins frozen in place. And then, in the back of the room, she saw Sarah Miller, and Sarah was smiling, a small, secret, triumphant smile. Clara began to walk. She did not hurry. She did not hesitate. She walked through the silent, parted crowd as if she were walking through a field of wheat. She walked past the whispers that had started to rise like the rustle of dry leaves, past the glares and the stares. Her destination was the far side of the room, where the men from the North Ridge Ranch were standing in a tight, protective cluster. She walked toward her people. She walked toward Luke. He stepped forward to meet her. The fiddler, recovering from his shock, tentatively drew his bow across the strings, and a slow, sweet waltz began to fill the stunned silence. Luke did not speak. He simply looked down at her, his blue eyes full of a fierce, quiet pride. He held out his hand. She placed her hand in his. His grasp was strong and sure. He led her to the center of the empty floor. He placed one hand on her waist, and with the other, he took her hand, and they began to dance. They moved together, turning slowly in the middle of the room, enclosed in their own small world. The shocked stares of the entire town were a wall around them. But for the first time, Clara did not feel trapped. She felt free. She looked up at Luke's face, at the serious, gentle lines of his mouth, at the unwavering loyalty in his eyes, and she knew she was home. For the first time in her life, she was not trying to make herself smaller. She was taking up space, her purple dress swirling, her loose hair brushing against his shoulder. She was a bold, unapologetic statement in the center of their narrow, frightened world. And for the first time in her life, no one was telling her to bow her head. The dance at the Winter Festival marked a subtle but profound shift in the currents of Clara's life. It was not that the whispers in Red Hollow ceased entirely, but their power was diminished. By refusing to hide, by standing in the center of the room and claiming her place, she had transformed herself from a subject of gossip into an enigma. They did not understand her, and their confusion began to outweigh their condemnation. The town watched her now with a wary curiosity, the judgment in their eyes tempered by a grudging respect for a woman who would not be bowed. At the ranch, the change was more tangible. The quiet deference of the Cowboys deepened into a familial ease. They began to bring her small gifts from the wild, a handful of late-season berries, a striking hawk's feather, a curiously shaped river stone. It was their way of saying they saw her, not just as the cook, but as a part of the landscape of their lives. Her relationship with Luke settled into a quiet, comfortable orbit. The unspoken tension between them had not vanished, but it had softened into a deep, mutual trust. They worked together, partners in the truest sense, running the domestic and operational sides of the ranch in a seamless, unspoken rhythm. There were no declarations, no promises made. There was simply the shared reality of their days, the quiet conversations by the fire, the way he would look at her across a crowded room. It was enough. The mending and coffee room thrived through the harsh winter months, a pocket of warmth and light against the endless white. It became a vital artery for the homestead women, a place where news was shared, comfort was given, and the crushing loneliness of a frontier winter was held at bay. Clara, in creating a space for them, had inadvertently created a home for herself, a place rooted not in property or marriage, but in the fertile ground of community and shared need. She was happy. It was a simple, quiet happiness, like a sturdy, slow-burning fire, and she guarded it closely, for she had never known its like before. The letter arrived on a day when the first signs of spring were beginning to fight their way through the retreating snow. The mail rider, a wiry man who came through only once a month, handed her a single, thin envelope. The moment she saw the spidery, forward-slanting script and the Kansas postmark, a cold dread snaked its way around her heart. It was a ghost, a voice from a life she had buried. She took the letter to her cabin, her hands trembling slightly. She sat on the edge of her cot and stared at it. At the name, Mrs. Elias Wynne, written in her brother-in-law Thomas's precise, unforgiving hand. She had not been that person for a long time. Opening it felt like a betrayal of the woman she had become. With a deep breath, she broke the seal. The paper was stiff, the words formal and devoid of warmth. "Clara," it began, dispensing with any pretense of affection. "I hope this letter finds you in good health. I write to you on a matter of some urgency regarding the estate of my late brother, your husband, Elias. It has come to our attention during the final accounting of his affairs that a small parcel of land, some 40 acres to the north of the main farm, as well as a modest sum of money held in the bank at Lawrence, were left solely and directly in your name." Clara's breath hitched. She had known nothing of this. Elias had never been a man to discuss finances with her. Her role was to manage the household, not the assets. While it was surely his intention that these properties would eventually be folded back into the family holdings, the letter continued, a subtle, proprietary tone creeping into the script. "The law is unfortunately quite clear on the matter. The land and the funds are legally yours. As such, we cannot settle the remainder of the estate or finalize the division of property among the rest of the family until the matter of your inheritance is resolved. We require your signature on the enclosed documents to release the property for sale. Of course, the proceeds would be forwarded to you directly. Mother and I both feel it would be most proper for you to return to Kansas to see to these matters in person. There is a small cottage on the edge of town that is available for a very reasonable price. It would be a suitable and respectable home for a woman in your position. It is time, we feel, for you to come home and resume a proper life. Your brother-in-law, Thomas Wynne." She read the letter twice, the cold, formal words sinking into her like ice shards. A proper life, a suitable home. The phrases were suffocating. The letter was not an offering, it was a summons. It was a demand that she return and once again become the person they needed her to be, the quiet, respectable, manageable widow of Elias Wynne. But the offer was undeniably real. 40 acres, a sum of money. She had no idea how much, but it would be more than she could earn in 5 years of cooking for the ranch. It was security. It was a life free from the back-breaking labor of her current existence. She could have her own home, a place with a real floor and glass windows. She would never have to worry about running out of flour or the price of coffee again. It was an escape hatch from the relentless, grinding hardship of the frontier. It was an easy life, handed to her on a silver platter. She folded the letter, the crisp paper crackling in the quiet of the cabin. She should have felt relief, a surge of joy at this unexpected deliverance. Instead, all she felt was a profound and unsettling turmoil. For the next few days, the letter was a physical weight in her apron pocket. Her mind was a battleground, two opposing futures warring for dominance. She imagined the life in Kansas, a small, clean cottage, a garden, enough money to live quietly, comfortably. But she also saw the faces of the townspeople, their looks of pity and condescension. She felt the invisible walls of propriety closing in around her, the endless, stifling obligation to be Elias's grieving widow for the rest of her days. It would be a safe life, a comfortable life. It would be a life lived in a small, well-appointed cage. Then she would look around her, at the raw, untamed beauty of the valley. She would feel the satisfying ache in her muscles after a day of hard work. She would hear the easy laughter of the cowboys in the mess hall. She would see the gratitude in Sarah Miller's eyes. This life was hard, uncertain, and perilous. But it was hers. Every callus on her hands, every stitch she sewed, every meal she cooked, it was all hers, earned and owned. Luke knew something was wrong. He didn't press her, but she saw the question in his eyes. He watched her as she moved about her chores, her brow furrowed in thought, her usual serene composure replaced by a restless energy. One afternoon, he found her staring into the fire in the mess hall, the letter open in her hand. "News from home?" he asked. his voice gentle. She looked up, her eyes full of the conflict that was tearing her apart. Without a word, she handed him the letter. He read it, his expression unreadable. He read it twice, then slowly folded it and handed it back to her. "It's a good offer," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "A chance for an easier life." She waited for him to say more, to give her advice, to tell her what to do. She waited for him to ask her to stay, but he didn't. He simply stood there, his gaze steady, his silence a testament to his profound respect for her. He was giving her the one thing no one in Kansas ever had the freedom to make her own choice. "It's your decision to make, Clara," he said softly. "No one else's." Then he turned and left her alone with the weight of it. That afternoon, she knew she could not find the answer inside the walls of the ranch. She needed space. She needed perspective. She left the warmth of the kitchen and began to walk, her limp barely noticeable now. She headed for a low, grassy hill that rose to the west of the ranch buildings, a place she had often looked at but had never climbed. The climb was steep, and she was breathing hard when she reached the top. The wind was clean and cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp, thawing earth. From here, she could see the entire valley spread out below her like a map. The mountains, their peaks still capped with snow, stood like silent, ancient guardians. The sky was a vast, impossibly blue bowl. The world felt immense, and her own troubles suddenly seemed very small. She looked down at the North Ridge Ranch. It was not an impressive sight, just a cluster of simple, weathered buildings, a thread of smoke rising from a chimney, a few horses moving lazily in a corral. It was a small, fragile outpost of humanity in a vast, indifferent wilderness. Then, her eyes began to pick out the details, the small signs of life that were invisible from the valley floor. She saw two of the cowboys, Hank and Dave, working together to repair a section of fence, their movements practiced and synchronized. She saw a small group of women, Sarah Miller among them, gathered on the porch of the mending room, their heads bent together in conversation. And then, she heard it, a sound that carried faintly on the wind, clear and pure as a silver bell, the sound of a child's laughter, erupting from the open door of the room she had built. It was Jacob Miller, his fever long gone, now strong enough to chase a stray puppy around his mother's feet. Her gaze shifted to the barn. Luke was there, standing by the outdoor forge. He was not giving orders or supervising. He was working, his sleeves rolled up, his powerful arms swinging a hammer as he heated and reshaped a piece of iron, a broken hinge from the main gate. The rhythmic, ringing clang of his hammer on the anvil echoed up the hillside, a sound of creation, of repair, of useful, honest work. He was not a man who owned the land. He was a man who served it. She stood there on that windy hill, the letter from Kansas in her pocket, a cold, dead weight. Down below was the life it was offering to buy her away from. She looked at the sturdy, simple buildings, at the working men, at the community of women, at the sound of a child's laughter. She looked at Luke, his face intent, his body strong and sure, a man who had given her not a cage, but the reins. The life in Kansas was an inheritance of property. It was a life of receiving. The life in Oregon was an inheritance of the spirit. It was a life of creating. A profound, unshakable peace settled over her. The turmoil in her heart ceased. The battle was over. The choice was not even a choice at all. It was simply a recognition of a truth that had been growing in her soul for months. She turned her face into the wind and closed her eyes, a slow smile spreading across her lips. The money and the land in Kansas were a fact, but the life below her was a truth, and they were not the same thing. She took a deep breath, the clean, cold mountain air filling her lungs, and then she let it out in a long, slow sigh of absolute contentment. "I have enough," she whispered to the vast, silent sky. She had more than enough. She wrote the letter to Thomas that evening, by the light of a single kerosene lamp. The words came easily, stripped of the anger and turmoil that had plagued her for days. Her handwriting was as neat and clear as the columns in her ledger, each sentence a small, solid brick in the new foundation of her life. Dear Thomas, thank you for informing me of the inheritance. It was a kindness I did not expect. I'm grateful for the security Elias intended for me. However, my life is here in Oregon now. I have found meaningful work and a place within this community. I cannot, therefore, return to Kansas to see to these matters in person. She paused, choosing her next words with care. She would not be accusatory or emotional. She would simply be honest. Please use this letter as my legal authorization to act on my behalf. Sell the land. Donate the proceeds from the sale and whatever funds are in the bank to the church in our old parish, or use them to help a new family get their start. Consider it my contribution to the home I have left behind. I wish you and Mother Wynne nothing but peace. I have all that I require. Sincerely, Clara Wynne. She sealed the envelope, the act feeling as final and momentous as the signing of a treaty. She was ceding the territory of her past. She was relinquishing her claim to the name Mrs. Elias Wynne and all the gilded privileges and invisible cages that came with it. In return, she was claiming a different kind of territory herself. Spring arrived in the valley with a fierce and sudden grace. The snow receded, revealing the rich, dark earth, and the hillsides erupted in a riot of pale green and the bold colors of wildflowers. It was calving season, a time of relentless work and raw, new life. The air buzzed with energy, the constant lowing of the mother cows and the bleating of their newborn calves. It was a beautiful, exhausting, and dangerous time. The protective instincts of a new mother cow were a force to be reckoned with, and the calves themselves were magnets for trouble, their innocent curiosity leading them into all manner of perils. The accident happened on a bright, clear afternoon. Clara was in the mending room, showing Sarah Miller how to patch a pair of denim trousers, when young Billy skidded to a halt outside, his horse lathered in sweat, his face pale with panic. "It's Luke," he gasped, his voice tight. "A calf. It fell into the old washout by Miller's Creek. The mother went half wild, wouldn't let anyone near. Luke went down to rope the calf himself. He got it out, but the bank gave way. A rock slide. He's hurt." A cold stillness fell over Clara. She felt no panic, no hysteria. Instead, a singular, icy focus took hold of her. She handed the trousers back to Sarah. "Keep the coffee on," she said, her voice calm and even. "The men will need it when they return." She walked out into the yard, her eyes scanning the trail from the creek. The women on the porch fell silent, watching her, their faces etched with worry. Clara stood perfectly still, her hands clasped at her waist, a solitary, waiting figure. She was no longer a newcomer, a spectator to the ranch's dramas. She was its heart, and she could feel the panicked, irregular beat of its pulse. They brought him back an hour later. He was not on his horse. He was walking, leaning heavily on Hank, his left leg dragging, his face pale and tight with pain. His trousers were torn at the knee, the fabric dark with blood. Clara's eyes met his across the yard. He gave her a weak, grim smile, an attempt at reassurance that did nothing to soothe the cold knot in her stomach. They helped him into the main house, to a small, Spartan room off the main hall that was sometimes used for injured hands. It contained little more than a cot, a washstand, and a chair. It smelled of dust and old linen. Clara followed them in, her focus absolute. "All right, that's enough," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with an authority that no one questioned. "Hank, thank you. Go get some coffee. I'll take care of this." The men, relieved to be dismissed from a situation that their clumsy hands were not equipped for, shuffled out of the room, leaving Clara and Luke alone in the sudden, heavy silence. He sank onto the edge of the cot, his breath hissing out through his teeth as his leg bent. The injury was a deep, ragged gash along the side of his knee. a wound of torn flesh and scraped bone where the rocks had caught him. It was not a hero's wound. It was the simple, brutal price of work in a hard land. Clara moved with a silent efficiency. She filled a basin with warm water from the pitcher on the stand. She found clean cloths. She retrieved the small bottle of carbolic acid she kept for doctoring the men's more serious cuts and scrapes. And then, she knelt on the floor in front of him. The posture felt natural, an act not of supplication, but of service. She gently took his leg, lifting it onto her lap to get a better look at the wound. His muscles were tense with pain. "This will sting," she said softly. He just nodded, his eyes closing, his jaw tight. Her hands were steady as she began to clean the wound. She worked with a focused, gentle precision, her touch light but firm, clearing away the dirt and blood, assessing the damage. He did not flinch, but she could feel the tremors of pain that racked his body. In this moment, the dynamic between them was completely inverted. The strong, untouchable foreman was now vulnerable, his well-being entirely in her hands. And she, the woman he had rescued from a train platform, was the one providing the strength and the care. She worked in silence, her movements sure and competent. She was aware of his eyes on her, of his gaze tracing the line of her bent head, the focused set of her mouth. The air in the room was thick with unspoken things, with the history of the past few months, the storm, the dance, the letter. When she had cleaned the wound as best she could, she looked up at him. His face was slick with a thin sheen of sweat, his blue eyes dark with pain and something else, something she couldn't quite read. "You're stronger than I ever knew," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of discovery, of awe. A small, sad smile touched Clara's lips. She thought of the woman who had arrived in Red Hollow, a woman who flinched at her own shadow, who apologized for the very air she breathed. She thought of the years in Kansas, of the constant, exhausting effort of making herself smaller, weaker, less threatening. "No," she replied, her voice soft but clear as a bell in the quiet room. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I just stopped pretending to be weak." The truth of her words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. He absorbed them, his expression shifting. The awe in his eyes was replaced by a look of profound, heart-stopping understanding. He saw her then, not just the competent cook or the brave woman who had ridden into a storm. He saw the person she had been all along, buried beneath layers of duty and expectation. He saw the soul she had fought so hard to reclaim. Slowly, he reached out and took her hand, not the one holding the bloody cloth, but her free hand, which was resting on her knee. His grip was surprisingly strong, and it sent a jolt of warmth through her. His touch was an anchor, a statement. She stopped her work and simply looked at him, her hand held fast in his. "Clara," he began, his voice raspy. He swallowed, gathering his strength, his gaze never leaving hers. "I read your letter to your brother-in-law. You left it on the table. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have, but I did." She said nothing, just waited. "You gave it all up," he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "The land, the money, the easy life." He paused, and his next words were filled with a raw, vulnerable honesty she had never heard from him before. "I have nothing like that to offer you. This ranch, this life, it's hard. It's uncertain. I can't promise you a cottage with a white picket fence. I can't promise you much of anything at all." He took a shaky breath. "So, I need you to know, this isn't a proposal. I'm not asking you to be my wife. I'm not asking you to belong to me." He tightened his grip on her hand, his eyes pleading with her to understand the distinction, to hear what he was truly trying to say. "I'm just asking," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Will you stay? Not for me, but for yourself. Will you make this place your home, because it's the home you choose?" The question settled into the quiet room, a question of immense and terrifying importance. He was not offering her the cage of marriage, the traditional solution to a woman's lone existence. He was offering her a choice, a confirmation of her own autonomy. He was asking her to commit not to him, but to the life she had built, to the woman she had become. He was asking her to finally, fully, claim her own freedom. Right here, beside him. Tears pricked the back of her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Crying was for the woman she used to be, the one whose emotions were a flood she could not control. The woman kneeling on the floor of this dusty room was made of sterner, clearer stuff. Her answer was not in tears. It was in the quiet, unshakable certainty of her own heart. She looked at him, at this good, honest, quiet man who saw her not as a problem to be solved, but as a person to be respected. She looked at his hand holding hers, a connection not of ownership, but of partnership. She did not speak. There were no words for the feeling that filled her chest, a feeling of peace so profound it was almost a physical presence. She simply, slowly, nodded. One single, decisive nod. It was a promise. It was an answer. It was the quiet, final, and most important word of all. It was yes. Her single nod was not the end of a conversation, but the beginning of a new one, a quiet dialogue that unfolded not in words, but in the shared rhythm of their days. Luke's leg healed, leaving a jagged silver scar on his knee that served as a quiet reminder of the day the foundation between them had settled into something solid and true. Nothing was said aloud. No promises were exchanged in the moonlight, but a new certainty lived between them, as tangible and nourishing as the bread she baked each morning. The spring deepened, turning the valley into a tapestry of impossible greens. The creek, which had been a frozen, silent thing all winter, now chattered and sang over the rocks. The air was soft, carrying the sweet, heady scent of pine sap and wildflowers. Life, which had been a hard, grim battle for survival against the cold, now felt like a gift, a celebration. The new calves, once fragile and shivering, were now sturdy and bold, their playful antics a constant source of amusement for the weary cowboys. The mending and coffee room was no longer just a shelter from the storm. It was the valley's heart. Its door was always open now, and the porch was a gathering place. The children of the homesteads played in the dirt yard outside while their mothers visited within, their laughter a new and welcome music at the ranch. Clara had created more than a room. She had woven a community. Its threads spun from kindness, coffee, and common ground. She had discovered a truth she never would have learned in Kansas, that true strength was not found in solitary independence, but in the resilience of a connected web of lives. On a sun-drenched afternoon, with a gentle breeze stirring the new leaves on the cottonwood trees, Clara sat on the porch of the mending room. Beside her sat Mary, Sarah Miller's eldest daughter, a serious-faced girl of 7 with her mother's wide, earnest eyes. A small, discarded shirt lay across Mary's lap, and in her small, clumsy fingers, she held a needle and a large, white button. "You see," Clara said softly, her voice a low, patient murmur, "you must go through both holes and then cross over to the other side, like you're making a little chows to mark the spot." She gently guided the girl's hand, her touch light and reassuring. Mary's brow was furrowed in concentration, her lower lip caught between her teeth. She pushed the needle through the cloth, a small, triumphant grunt escaping her as it appeared on the other side. It was not a perfect stitch. It was too loose and slightly off-center, but it was hers. "There you go," Clara praised her, a warm, genuine smile lighting her face. "That's it exactly. Now, do it again." She leaned back in her chair, content to watch the small drama unfold. In Kansas, teaching a child to sew would have been a duty, a part of the prescribed role of a woman. Here, it was a joy. It was the passing on of a small, useful piece of magic, a skill that would serve this child for the rest of her life. She was not just teaching her to mend a shirt. She was teaching her how to hold things together. She was so absorbed in the moment that she didn't hear Luke approach. She only sensed him, a familiar, solid presence at the edge of her vision. She looked up and saw him leaning against the doorframe, a tin cup of coffee cradled in his hands. He wasn't looking at her, but at the scene on the porch, at her and the small, determined girl by her side. A quiet, contemplative look was on his face, his blue eyes soft in the afternoon light. He was watching the world she had built, the quiet, gentle civilization she had coaxed into bloom in this wild place. Mary, with a final, determined push, finished her last stitch. She held up the shirt, the button attached, slightly crooked but undeniably secure. A wide, proud grin split her face. "I did it, Mrs. Wynne, I did it." "So you did," Clara said, her heart swelling. "And it is the finest sewn button I have ever seen." The little girl scrambled off the porch and ran, shirt held high like a banner, to show her mother, who was talking with another woman by the creek. The small porch was suddenly quiet, the air filled only by the buzzing of a bee and the distant lowing of a cow. Clara looked over at Luke. He met her gaze, a slow, easy smile touching his lips. He pushed himself off the doorframe and walked over, taking a seat on the porch step near her chair. He sipped his coffee, and they sat for a long moment in the comfortable silence that was their native tongue. She looked out at the valley, at the vibrant, living proof of the life she had chosen. She saw the sturdy ranch buildings, the greening pastures, the distant, majestic peaks. It was a life of hard work, of calloused hands and aching muscles, but it was a life of profound and simple beauty, and it was a life of her own making. The last, faintest ghost of her old fear, the one that had haunted her for a lifetime, chose that moment to whisper its final question. It was not a question born of doubt or regret, but of a quiet, soul-deep awe at the sheer, improbable fact of her own happiness. She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper, a sound meant only for him and the quiet afternoon. "What if someday I'm wrong, Luke?" she asked, the words soft and thoughtful. "What if I chose this life, and it turns out to be a mistake?" He didn't laugh or dismiss her question. He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, unwavering understanding. He heard the lifetime behind the words. He heard the girl who had been taught that every choice was a potential error, that a woman's role was to be so careful she never risked being wrong. He set his coffee cup down on the step beside him. He reached out, not to take her hand, but to simply lay his large, warm hand on her shoulder, a gesture of grounding, of unwavering support. He smiled, a gentle expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Then we learn," he said, his voice as simple and solid as the mountains around them. He gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze, "just like everyone else learns." And that was it. The answer was so simple, so sane, so full of grace that it extinguished the last lingering shadow of her fear. Wrong was not a final judgment. It was not a locked door. It was simply a lesson. It was a chance to begin again, but better. She looked at his hand on her shoulder, then at his face, at the quiet certainty in his eyes, and she felt something release inside her, a knot of tension she had carried in the base of her throat for so long she had forgotten it was even there. It was the lifelong habit of holding her breath, of waiting for the other shoe to drop, of bracing for the disapproval that was sure to follow any act of self-will. She turned her face toward the sun, closed her eyes, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she took a full and complete breath. It was a breath that started deep in her belly and filled her lungs to their very capacity, a breath free from the confinement of corsets and the constriction of fear. It was the breath of a free woman, standing on her own ground, under an open sky. And as she slowly let it out, it felt like the most profound and hopeful prayer she had ever uttered. She was home. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with fellow listeners. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach even more people, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.